Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I'm back one day after the previous episode. I would say that not much has changed, but I actually had a kind of significant and ugly psychological breakthrough, realization, whatever. It was pretty draining, and it hasn't given me any insight into how to live better, but at least it left me even more aware of how deep the wound lies, I guess. But you don't need to hear any of that. You heard me rambling on last episode. You are not my non-existent therapist. You are here for a fun conversation. So we're going to get right to it. Today's episode features the return of designer, typographer, artist, writer, and all sorts of other hyphenates, Rian Hughes. Rian's second novel, The Black Locomotive, just came out in the U.S. this week from Pan Macmillan. The Black Locomotive is a really, really fun science fiction novel about, we'll say, the secret history of London. I'll put it that way. The plot is that a covert government rail line that's being built under the city encounters an anomaly that stops the boring machine in its tracks. And as the authorities start to explore it, they realize that something really big underlays London. And Rian's weird and compelling cast of characters, including a rail engineer and the project's artist in residence, they try to come to terms with a structure beneath the city that has to be from somewhere else. It's not too spoilery to say it's not from Earth, but that's less pivotal to the Black Locomotive than how his characters relate to their city and how they come to understand its place and its history. And this is a book that shows Rian's deep love for London, warts and all. He's quite cognizant of what's terrible about it, and there is a semi-apocalyptic scene within it where some of the worst aspects of London are evoked. But anyway, like its title, the book, it takes a little while to build up steam, but then it becomes this rampaging, propulsive force that it would be spoilery to talk about the role of steam trains and black locomotives in the book. So I'll let Rian do it in our conversation. But it all makes for a fun, intricate, engaging science fiction novel about deep history and the war of ideas, the issue of obsolescence, and what it means to live in a city with other people and what cities can really become. Now, because it's Rian Hughes, typography and design are also significant characters in the book. While the Black Locomotive is in the third person limited, each major character, they have their own typeface, conveying whose perspective you're in. And when things start to get real science fiction-y, the typography also takes on a life of its own. And in that respect, it's similar to Rian's first novel, XX, which we had a conversation about back in 2020. But The Black Locomotive is a more manageable length, and the narrative doesn't cover the end of the known universe like this previous book does. But it makes for a great companion with that XX, and both novels show Rian's deep love of both science fiction and London. So go check out The Black Locomotive, and if you haven't read XX yet, get that too, because you're in for a treat. Oh, I should also mention the book is filled with diagrams for daily living, covers from a non-existent newsletter magazine for a steam train aficionado club, which is really the core of the novel, and a lot more interesting graphic stuff, what with Rian being Rian. But it all makes The Black Locomotive a book that needs to be experienced as a book. I know a lot of readers have I'll just get it on Kindle or whatever for some of my suggestions, but this is something you really need to hold in your hand and to flip from page to page to really get what Ryan's doing in the course of the book. Now, the other thing that Ryan's released, or the other book that Ryan's released since we last talked, is a specialty title. It's called Ray Guns and Rocket Ships, Vintage Science Fiction Book Cover Art. And it's a glorious reproduction of a whole bunch of the book covers in Ryan's collection of SF paperbacks from the 40s and 50s. This one's gorgeous. It is great to look at. Between the covers and the essays, it sort of tells a story of this weird era in publishing history, and all of these artists, some of whom were named and renowned, others who kind of didn't make as much of a dent. But Ray Guns and Rocket Ships is from Correro Press. I got it through the Kickstarter for the book, so I got this whole nice hardcover slipcase thing, but it looks like it's available on their website, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes for this. Now, my one caveat about this one, while the U.S. release of The Black Locomotive is this week, it came out in the U.K. about 2 years ago. And to that extent, Ryan is, as you can tell from this conversation and our previous one, he is all about the future and moving forward. So he had a lot more to say / hint about the new novel that he's working on. So if you think we didn't do enough justice for Black Locomotive, hit me up. I'll tell you all sorts of great stuff about it. And a caveat from yesterday's episode with Eddie Campbell. When we talked about his daughter Haley Campbell's book, All the Living and the Dead, he misremembered the year. He thought it was 2020. It actually came out beginning of 2022, caused the same problems that we talked about, which was a publisher who was a little skittish about a book on death. In this case, at the time that the Ukraine war was starting, but he was sort of conflating it with the start of the pandemic. Anyway, he emailed me to apologize when I did correct him on that, and he said, no, it was 2020. So anyway, I just figured I'd include that little note here. Now here is Ryan's bio. Rian Hughes is a graphic designer, illustrator, comic artist, writer, and type designer who has worked extensively for British and American advertising, music, and comic book industries. He has written and drawn comics for 2000 AD and Batman Black and White, and designed logos for the Avengers, the X-Men, Superman, record label Head Candy, MTV, and James Bond. He has edited books on mid-century lifestyle illustration and custom typography, and written on semiotics, culture, and collecting vintage science fiction pulps and paperbacks. He is the author of the novels XX and The Black Locomotive. And now, the 2023 Virtual Memories Conversation with Rian Hughes. It's been a few years since the UK publication, but we're getting it in the US now. Tell me where the Black Locomotive began for you.
The idea for the story. I think what I wanted to do, because writing novels is my new job, my sort of left turn. I mean, having worked for a long time with many, many writers designing their books and comics, graphic novels, and also as a comic book artist, I'm surprised that it's taken me this long to attempt a novel or two, although I have written occasional comic strips. But after the somewhat chunky volume that was XX, I thought it would be instructive to try and write something that was shorter, much more linear from a story point of view, had a trajectory and a velocity in more ways than one that took you through, something that eased up somewhat on the philosophical asides, and it still had the design and typographic experiments, but I reined all those in much more. So
the semiotics too.
Yes. It was just.
Although there are passages, the very Ballardian passages in the first 100 pages, yes, especially. But yeah.
I'm now officially Ballardian, which is a dream come true. It's something that I aspired to and now am. Officially, several times over, several reviews use the term Ballardian. So it's a sort of simpler, much more plot driven book, which it sort of has appealed to some people more because of that, and other people less because of that. But you're never going to entertain everyone all the time with everything you do.
So you've learned that lesson as a writer pretty quick. That's good, because some writers take forever to figure that part of it out. But yeah, that sense of, I guess, one of the biggest questions that just came over the entirety of the book for me was, can you just tell me about his London? What is Rian Hughes' London? Because this book is very much, for all the science fiction and adventure and everything else, it's a big Valentine to your city.
It is. Well, there are several people who have a love affair with London in Black Locomotive, but they have a very different kind of love affair with it. I mean, the Rutherford character, the artist in residence, does have the sort of Ballardian sort of psychotectural view of London as sort of a series of sort of volumes and spaces within which certain prescribed things happen. The sort of urban planning ideal of London. And the Austin Arnold character has, again, a love affair with London, but he's my sort of much more grounded, less poetic, less artistic, more practical engineering POV of London. But it did allow me to sing the praises of both the positive aspects of London and the negative aspects of London. When I say it's a love letter to London, it's also a critique of London and the faults that any big city has.
But it condemns, but is still, we'll say celebratory in a number of ways. And to me, my London's very sparse. I've had a few, I used to go when I was a kid, because my mom is from Hendon, or Golders Green. She'll correct me if she actually listens to this one. I've only got back a few times over the years since, but it's a very felt novel in that respect. Even with Rutherford's almost clinical approach to these things, the way he sort of sees space and is trying to make sense of it. It still feels very much like somebody who loves the city that he's in. But that's, again, part of the joy of reading it is getting that out of the prose and the POVs of the various characters.
Did you see anything in London that you recognised? Or did it seem like an abstracted version of London that, as probably more of an outsider, you didn't resonate with?
No, there are little moments like the gallery. I'm blanking on National Portrait Gallery.
Yes,
comes up. There's spatially, remembering what's around there and sort of visualizing that was helpful. Not as much as when like William Gibson would set something in Union Square in Manhattan, and I can conceptualize the entire space, figure out what part of the square he's got characters walking into and out of. But yeah, it evoked a city for me.
I think that growing up reading American comics and novels, it was always a treat when something was set somewhere you were familiar with, and being that this is where I live, it sort of seems absurd to set it anywhere else but London. But I think also because I grew up in the suburbs, you do have a slightly different relationship with London, the city, than someone who probably actually lives in the midst of it all. I mean, the midst of London is very much a office and retail space rather than a residential space. Or obviously there are a lot of residential flats, mostly in the centre of London. But most people's experience will be that you grow up in a suburb that is maybe 20 minutes, half an hour on a tube from London. So your early experiences of the city are going with your friends to gigs or bars, or starting your first job in town, maybe, or going on a shopping spree to your local comic shop or your science fiction shop, or going shopping for clothes or records, things like that. So it's a kind of it's an architectural place, but it's also a sort of a cultural hub where you go and explore all these different exciting aspects of youth culture that you're coming into contact with. And growing up in the suburbs, you also feel that there's very little interesting happening where you are. It all seems to be happening somewhere else, but within easy reach.
I've lived my whole life 25 miles from New York City. You can see New York City and the skyline from about a mile from where I live.
Right.
And it's always been, it's there. It's good that it's there. I can go in and I can hide out in the woods, for the rest of my time. But yeah, New York, I've always had that sort of relationship with. This is a little bit longer to get into town, but it's the same thing. It's the greatest city in the world, but it's at arm's reach, and I have bear wandering around my backyard some mornings. So I get that weird sort of
foxes balance. Wandering around in the garden here, urban foxes.
We've gotten those in the last 10 or 15 years. I've lived here my whole life, and foxes have shown up in the last 10 or 15 years, and you know what they screech like. It's
God, they sound like wailing babies or something. I thought someone was murdering their children the first time I heard it.
Exactly. It's down the woods behind our house. I heard this screaming and screeching. What the hell is that? And Amy's looking online, trying to find something. It's, no, those are what foxes sound like. Okay. But yeah, that's a recent
it's interesting
addition
that they're
us.
getting bolder where you are as well, because they definitely seem to be coming out in daytime, and they're much less apprehensive of humans than they ever were before. So maybe foxes all over are communicating with each other and plotting to take over the world.
Probably using the, you figure somebody has to, and it's not going to be us anymore. So the other question, besides the Ballard side of things, big Mr. X fan?
Oh yes, absolutely.
When you were coming up,
Dean Waters'
I
Mr.
assumed,
X.
even right down to the design of the Black Locomotive cover, but everything about the psychotecture felt very, that Dean Motter and
no, I love Dean
Mr.
Motter
X
and Jaime's early Mr. X stories were fantastic. The look of them, the sort of reflections on the city, the idea that your architect is your hero. I think a lot of that fed in some way or another, not possibly not so obviously, but it's certainly part of that DNA that the book has.
Yeah. So tell me what you're learning about fiction writing and what you've sort of found out about yourself as a writer over the course of two published novels and other stuff in progress.
That's an interesting question. I think because I've come to this quite late, I feel like I'm probably learning techniques and lessons that most writers would learn very early on in their career. And I'm sure that there are various things that a more polished and experienced writer could teach me. But I think that there is, having sort of worked in advertising and in things like book design, where quite a lot of the time you'll get sent text to include, for example, on a CD cover or a book jacket or what have you, and it can be really badly written. And so you end up by being a kind of unpaid editor, sub-editor on other people's text, especially if you're working with, say, a band. I mean, a band, you might get 3 or 4 members, all of which who have a different grasp of the English language, and you have to make this all more coherent and elegant. So, but there's a terseness that, say, advertising copy always has. If you can take something out and you'll not lose any of the meaning, I would do that. And also the designers, the graphic designers that I like. I think that the word graphic, as in graphic violence or graphic sex, even something like that, means explicit. And I think that graphic design at its best has that straightforward, punchy, explicit aspect to it. And that's the kind of bold design that appeals to me, rather than say, more sort of folksy, over-detailed, sort of whimsical stuff, or stuff that has surface but no depth. Stuff that's style over substance doesn't really appeal to me. But so I sort of aim for passages that have a edited precision to them. But then I'm also guilty of having lengthy, florid, over-descriptive passages as well. So I kind of oscillate between these two modes, one of being as terse as I possibly can, and one of being as evocative and descriptive as I possibly
say over the top, but descriptive is good. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not really sure which voice is mine, or whether maybe it's a case of alternating between these two voices as is required. So one character, for example, Austin Arnold, will be more terse and less given to evocative reflections, whereas Rutherford is the opposite. He's the artist, he's the poet. That's the way he sees the world. So it's more appropriate to put those kinds of reflections or observations on the nature of London or in cities in general in his mouth. I think that's the beauty of having a range of characters that you can use to voice whatever mood you happen to be in.
What do you see? Well, do you see progression so far? I mean, from XX to, and I don't know if they were written concurrently or, the idea that you may have finished a 1,000-page novel and then just turned around and knocked out the Black Locomotive pisses me off because of my lack of productivity. But, how do you see yourself, I guess, progressing? Or what are you learning?
XX was actually delayed for a year. So it did seem very much like I'd knocked out the Black Locomotive very quickly afterwards. But XX had been finished. And then it had been, I forget, looking back, how long it took to go through the editorial process. Yeah. And my agent, because there were several people who were interested in it, and so the actual deal took a while to finalise. And then when Picador had signed it, there was then a delay of a year between when we thought we were going to publish it and then when we did actually publish it, which meant that there was at least 2 years, maybe even longer, after I'd finished XX, in which I had got the bulk of the Black Locomotive done. So it looks like it came out I wrote it very speedily after XX, but that's just an illusion caused by,
and I guess
publishing
having to learn publishing timelines.
Yeah. And why it's taken, what are we now? Sort of like 3.5 years down the line, and I still haven't finished novel number 3, which is it's into the final furlong. So it will get there, but
Are we, without jinxing anything, without saying anything too much, staying in science fiction?
Yes.
We're saying too much.
as with the first two, it's set in London. It's set today or the day after tomorrow, maybe. In a kind of recent now, if you like. It covers some similar themes to XX. It has more, I wouldn't say sort of typographic fireworks, but it uses different magazine layouts, book layouts, things like that in it. In
a sort of found text kind of way?
Yes, in reference to an archive that the people have access to, kind of way. So the more sort of theatrical type experiments in XX are dialed back again for this one, but it does have much more of that kind of stuff than Black Locomotive did. I mean, it's whatever really suits the story. I mean, the form that the book takes, as with any piece of graphic design, should come in out of what it is that you're trying to express. And there's no point in me ladling on effects just for the sake of fireworks if that's not relevant to the plot or what it is that I'm trying to say. But this one, it's sort of probably about a halfway house in between the two books in appearance.
It's and I think we talked about it a bit the first time we spoke, which again is almost 3 years ago. You coming at writing from the unique perspective of also having typography integrated fully in the writing process, not fully, having that tension between typography and the prose itself and what you're doing graphically with it. When we spoke back in 2020, you said, a lot more writers should be looking at typography also and figuring out how to do this stuff. But you've got training and background in it, and a lot of them don't. Again, when we say XX is 1,000 pages, some of that is taken up by some of the typographical experiments and other non-full prose pages. But that sense for you of integrating or balancing prose itself and what you're doing visually with it?
I'm not sure what you're asking. I mean, you asked me about the
neither.
process.
I was hoping you were going to take that as a lead. But yeah, you consider XX as sort of the magnum opus of that, and that the subsequent books are refinements or ways of
Are you asking whether I've
dialing it back, but
myself on one novel and everything else would be mopping up?
Maybe I am. You really got it all out there the first time, and now it's figuring out where it works well and where it doesn't.
I think there's as many things that you can do with a novel, graphic, as you could do with graphic design in general. And graphic design as a process and a field shows no sign of running out of ideas. So I don't think that the form itself is limited and I could never explore all possibilities in one book. I think that the form of XX gave me the space to throw a lot of styles and a lot of experimentation on the page. And I think that in future it probably, well, again, it depends what the content of the book is, but I think the more focused the book is, the more focused the graphic design will have to be as well. So I think it might just show less of a spread of styles within the single volume, but maybe I'll explore different aspects of that book to book as is relevant, rather than all in one book. But I don't think there's any limits to. I'm sure there are things that I've not even thought of yet, and that other people, I hope, will.
Do you find that sense of discovery when you're working? Do you find yourself still in the wow? I can't believe I just managed to do, this, that, or the other, either with prose or with
there's
the
certain
visual
things that come together on the page really well, and you sort of sit back and you think, oh God, that really works. And I mean, there's another idea I had for a short story, which maybe I'm not sure what to do with it, and it's been kicking around in my head for 4 or 5 years now, and it would be maybe just 30 pages or something like that. And I don't know what to do with that, because, I don't know, as an author, you don't really get to publish a short story collection until you're several novels in. For some reason, short story collections don't sell as well as novels.
Yeah.
But I think that might be an interesting format to allow you to experiment with very different voices in a short form rather than the longer form. In vignettes rather than fully developed narratives. So it might be that I can come up with enough little experiments like that would add up to a novel's worth of short stories, or maybe I can interlink them somehow with some overarching narrative. I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. But as sort of regards the seeing it come together on the page, I think we did talk about this before, is that there are books that have had graphic design elements in them before, right back to Tristram Shandy, for example, which had not many, but little sort of graphic elements to describe where the plot goes and the way the characters sword, the shape that he makes through the air with it, or there's a page in there that's a marbled sort of end paper pattern that is tipped in, which of course I had to pay homage to with the marbled end paper in XX. But seeing it come together, so you're writing and designing at the same time. So as you type, you're seeing it in the font that you are using, and that font is a font that you yourself have had designed specifically for the tone of voice of your character. That is something I don't think's ever happened before, and I don't think it could have happened before, because if you were going to design a hot metal font for yourself for the sole purposes of each novel, it would be an almost insurmountable operation. So, but with having been versed in graphic design and font design for many years, these are all skills that I can sort of easily bring to bear on this. And the fact that we can assemble everything in something like InDesign, so the fonts, the images, the photographs, the illustrations, they're all there on the page. You can see exactly how they're working or not working, is essential. So I would imagine that in the past, people would probably write novels with graphic elements as traditional typewritten manuscripts, and then maybe the illustrations or there would be notes to the typesetter on how this might be laid out. Like I've seen, say, Apollinaire's sketches for his poems, and then the typesetter's versions of the poems. And you can see that there's a conversation going on between two people here. There's the poet, and then there's the technician, if you like, who is executing that poem. And there's always going to be some kind of interpretation or compromise or technical limitation that is going to govern what the final result looks like. And we now can bring all of those under one roof, so that one person has that ultimate control over all of these aspects. And it just sort of sings on the page when you get something right, when the font is speaking in the tone of voice that you envisage the character having, when the layout is emphasizing the cadence of that voice, where they're getting louder, where they're getting quieter, where they're laying emphasis on what they are saying. This is very hard to do in a normal text font unless you use a lot of italic or the occasional bold or something like that. We have very limited range of expressions in a regular book font, and normally how writers get around this is by saying there'll be a bit of prose, yes, exactly, and then they'll say he shouted. So the type itself is not shouting. You have to tell them what the tone of voice is. So the limitations of the form are ones that writers have worked their way around many times over the years. But it almost gets to the point where you don't need to. I was thinking that you could probably have passages where, if you do have different POV fonts, as we do in the Black Locomotive, you don't even need to say who is talking, because after a while you'll know who's talking. So all of that sort of page furniture that you would normally have, that would, the directions that say X character said, or X character stood up and crossed the room, and then they start talking. You have all these sort of shortcuts that tell the reader, clue the reader who is talking. You don't need any of those if you have a POV font. And in fact, in
the book, it's one thing to do that with chapters, as you do in the book, full segments, but maybe 2/3 of the way through, they start, one paragraph to the next is changing font and giving us, in the process, the other person's perspective on what's happening in the same scene.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that. Because to begin with, and each chapter is told from a bit different person's point of view. So each chapter has a different font, and we have maybe, I don't know.
I've got the color font here. It's got the number of fonts you use. I always like having a book that actually has to break that stuff down. And so even London has a font when I'm speaking in the voice of London. And of course, the font for London is the Johnston Railway font, the one that's used for the Underground here. It's just archetypally the font of not only London, but the
underground spaces underneath London, which are what the book is all about. So hopefully a lot of these fonts will bring a resonance that people will already be aware of, even if they're not typographers or designers. I'm hoping that they'll be familiar enough with some of these things that they'll get a feeling from them, an atmosphere from the different fonts. But you're right, is to begin with, it was pretty much chapter by chapter, because each chapter is a different POV. And then we get to a crucial point in the narrative where you've introduced these characters and they're all together experiencing this specific situation. And so I then, in one chapter, go from paragraph to paragraph to paragraph, each in a different font in that same chapter, so that you're jumping between different persons' POVs as they experience what is happening. And there were very few, if any, sort of editorial corrections or advice that I was given on XX and Black Locomotive. I mean, there was a line edit for, spelling or grammar or what have you. But I was sort of surprised at how little interference there was from the publisher. But one of the things that the editor did bring up on Black Locomotive, he said there was a note on that chapter, and he said, "This doesn't work for me," and I ignored it.
Okay.
I didn't even explain why it did work. I just thought, there's no way I can change that. Everything up to that point and the use of fonts has laid the groundwork for this to happen. Right. There's no way that...
You're not going to make the argument any better than what the page itself is arguing.
Exactly. So I just ignored it, and they didn't bring it up a second time.
I was going to ask, how have your writer peers, and you mentioned, again, the first time we recorded, also the number of writers you worked with over the years, either illustrating, making comics, etc. Have you gotten feedback on the first two books from some of the writers you've worked with?
Yes, a lot of my friends who are writers did get a early version when I did a print-on-demand version of XX and Black Locomotive, so it looks like a book, and that was what I sent out to the editor, to the publisher. It didn't ever exist in a manuscript form. And because it looks like an actual hardback book with a dust jacket and everything, and pretty much looked like how it looked when it was finally published, I was able to send these out to writer friends, and some of the quotes on the back of XX, the first edition, came from those friends. So I was very grateful for them. I mean, it was more a case of me wanting to know from them whether this was a big mistake on my behalf or whether it had any merit
that's
whatsoever.
Sort of what I was getting at.
It was a kind of sanity check more than anything else. So to get positive responses, and in some cases very positive responses from these people whose writing I very much respect, did give me the confidence that this might be a worthwhile project.
Yeah. Yeah, it sort of reminded me in the early days when Cages came out, and it turned out that Dave McKean wasn't just a great artist, or a great visual artist. And it was that son of a bitch can write too? God damn it,
How dare
it turns out, there's... And then it turns out he can do everything else, as we've learned over the years.
Including play instruments and write lyrics. And,
he did a musical tribute for my 500th episode.
Oh, really?
He actually sent a little song. I was like, well, because you're Dave McKean, okay, you're the greatest. So,
well, it's also nice to collaborate. I mean, with in XX, there was that album that developed from a music review that the fake music review that I wrote for XX, and then my sister Saren and a sort of musician DJ called DJ Food made that a reality. And in the Black Locomotive, we have the Smokebox song, which is this... it's a vinyl 7-inch that you get when, in the 70s, you sent off to be a member of the Smokebox Club. And without giving too much away, what links many of our characters together is that when they were children, that they were members of this thing called the Smokebox Club. And so they would have the badge and the newsletter and would write to each other in the pages of this newsletter. And as part of this, you get this record with the Smokebox on. And so I wrote the lyrics to this. And again, it started off without a tune in mind. And then I said to Sarah, I imagine this sounding like a 1970s TV show theme tune that it's so annoying and you cannot get it out of your head. But it's got this cheery, bouncy rhythm to it, and all the voices are these squeaky kids' voices that are annoyingly optimistic. And that's how it turned out. She went and wrote this thing, and DJ Food did a magnificent production on it with a sort of pub rock backbeat that really works well with steam whistles and other cheesiness in it, and even a fake vinyl crackle, so it sounds like it really has been taken from an old vintage record. And so that's on Bandcamp, and you get to a point in the novel where you can point your phone at a QR code and listen to that. So having done this in 2 novels, I think I'm wondering whether I should do this in the 3rd one as well. Once you've set yourself up for this, it's almost expected after a while.
You'll find an avenue. There'll be a moment of, a musical number here would be really good. And,
Well, there is actually, without having to force it, there is in the 3rd novel a song. And I won't say too much more about where and how that song arises, but I was thinking, do I do this again? Jinx yourself. People are going to think that I'm just trying to squeeze in another record from pals.
No, they'll say you're the multimedia creator. That's what they're going to say.
Well, those musical interludes are the bit that I had nothing to do with other than writing the lyrics, and other than being a vocalist on. There are 2 remixes of the Smokebox song, because I'm working with Scott Hoffman of the Scissor Sisters, very talented musician, songwriter, who is also having a sort of midlife change of career and writing comics. And so I've been designing 2 comics for him that are coming out on Comixology, and later on I think they'll be collected by Dark Horse. And the first of those is called Nostalgia. And the first 3 issues are out. I think it's being released weekly digitally. I think the 3rd issue has just come out. In fact, you should speak to Scott. I'm sure he'd love to talk about his process. And he offered to do a kind of Scissor Sisters remix of this TV theme tune from the 70s. And he did 2 versions of it, and he did one that was very much a kind of dark club mix, and then another one which was a much bouncier, sort of happier disco mix. And he wanted to sort of ask me which one I thought worked, but because both of them were fantastic, he ended up by doing both of them. So there are now up on Bandcamp the 2 Scott Hoffman dance mixes of the Black Locomotive, which are equally fantastic. And for the release in the US of Black Locomotive, he's done 2 new mixes, an extended mix, in which I actually read the entire Smoke. I say read, I don't sing it. I don't really have a singing voice. I can sort of do a monotone in a sort of Vincent Price in Thriller sort of fashion. So there's me, my sort of vocal debut, reading out the Smokebox song in the middle of this club disco extravaganza that he's put together. But no, it's fantastic.
Yeah, that's because I'd seen on your Instagram mentioning Nostalgia and Scott Hoffman. I was trying to remember where I knew the name from. So I'll have to hunt him down now or connect with you after this to try to set up. Let me ask though, you mentioned coming out weekly and Comixology, digital only comics. What's your vibe, I guess?
I'm a designer. I love the smell of print. It doesn't feel like it's a thing until it's a physical object. And most graphic designers I know, most comic artists I know, they're collectors. They have that gene where they want to line things up on a shelf and check things off on a list, and it's all that. It's probably the hunter-gatherer instinct that we had that meant that we would survive back in prehistory, but now instead of gathering berries, we're gathering comics or books or records or whatever it may be. It's just it's a misdirected impulse that used to have some use.
That thrill of the chase thing.
Sorry?
Yeah, that endorphin rush, the thrill of the chase thing.
Exactly.
The endorphin rush when that one issue you've been hunting for, for us, and you mentioned it in another project I want to talk about after this, there is that sense of, yeah, sure, I can find it on the internet, but it's not the same as, being in a bookstore or a comic store and, oh my God, I just saw, the thing I've been looking for since I was a little kid.
Yes. You're segueing very neatly into ray guns and rocket ships, which, in the introduction to that, I describe a situation in which that happened to me exactly. And there is that sort of collector gene that I think a lot of graphic designers have, a lot of writers have. We're cursed with it.
And it's a thing where, again, we'll talk about ray guns and rocket ships, which is a collection of science fiction pulp cover art. Is that capturing it well enough? Actually, you describe it.
Yeah, it's, we didn't really have pulps in the UK.
I've got in front of vintage science fiction book cover art. That's the subtitle.
Yeah, so we didn't really have pulps here in the way that the US had pulps. We had what are called story papers. So these would be weekly rather than monthly, and they would be more akin to a kind of large format comic, but with text stories in. And these would be schoolboy stories or Western stories or adventure stories, and they would be aimed at fairly young kids. So I would imagine between the ages of, say, 8, 10 to about 16, maybe. And although the American pulps were shipped in here, so we did get to see that. I say we, this is like way before my time. So this is from the sort of 30s, 40s up, then post-war up until the 60s, something like that, when the form kind of died because the paperback book almost supplanted it. But in the UK, we had the paperback, science fiction paperback, the cheap, straight to paperback format from very early on. So this book is a collection of those paperbacks rather than pulp magazines. And it's mostly culled from my own collection that I've picked up over the years, bit by bit. And then various holes in my collection, which is by no means complete. Although I do have a collector gene, I'm not much a completist for some reason.
You mentioned that in the introduction, that you're more... Well, again, you talk about your criteria that is not simply... Yeah,
it's not just getting complete. That last issue that fills a gap. And there has to be some beauty in and of the object itself that I'm responding to. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of rubbish that just fits a numerical hole, which is not... You think, why have I got these things? They're not. I'm not even enjoying this artist. Why did I buy this? So the holes in my collection were filled by various other collectors who I know who scanned in things for me or lent me things that I could scan in. And it's arranged mostly by publisher. And we had some really great, I say great, I use that in inverted commas, trashy, cheap publishers who would treat their authors very poorly. And there's a magnificent story that I quote in the introduction. There was a very prolific author called Lionel Fanthorpe, who was latterly known as the host for a TV show over here called Fortean TV. And he's a reverend, so he would appear in his reverend's gear on his motorbike introducing this TV show. But he had, early on in his career, he wrote these sci-fi pulps and also supernatural, sorry, not pulps, paperbacks, under a vast number of pseudonyms, most of which were anagrams of his name. So Lionel Roberts would become Robert Lionel, or Trebor Thorpe, or Bron Fane, all of these very transparent pseudonyms. But the way that it would work is that they would commission covers from an artist, and then they would ask him or another writer to come up with a series of potential titles that would fit this painting, cover painting, and blurbs that they could put on the back. And then the story would be written around that. So, and there would be a very specific word count, and he apparently would dictate these stories off the top of his head into reel-to-reel tape recorders, and then they would be typed up by his wife or a pool of typists. And he would pretty much write one a weekend, apparently. So you would expect these to be absolutely awful, these novels, and they are completely unstructured, a lot of them. You can see that he doesn't really know where they're going, and then he's rapidly approaching the required word count and wraps it all up very quickly at the end. But he can obviously write. He obviously has a training in the classics, and so they're full of allusions to, I don't know, Greek history or Shakespeare or things like this. So, he still is. I think he must be still around.
I just looked him up. He's 88 years old and still going. So, yeah. I was going to say, I just looked him up. 88, it's still alive. So.
Yeah. So there's so many stories like that from that period of British publishing. So many stories of people being ripped off, of artists not getting paid, of publishers dabbling in pornography and various other...
And writer slavery. You have a piece in there where a guy is basically just kept in a cell to keep writing these science fiction novels every week. Yeah. But...
And I spoke to people like Phil Harbottle, who wrote the afterword of the book, and he's done a lot of research on this period, and he was a great help. But yes, it's full of these stories of exploit. I mean, people think that the comic book industry is full of these kinds of stories, but it happened in the British... they call them the mushroom publishers. That's the kind of general term for that, because they mushroomed after the Second World War, after the relaxation of paper rationing, and all these fly-by-night opportunistic publishers flourished during that period. And Steve Holland has written a book called The Mushroom Jungle, which covers that part of British publishing. But yes, if they spotted an opportunity, then they would go for it. So whatever was flavour of the month, they would try and push out a gangster novel or a science fiction novel or a Western novel. And so you would get writers who were writing Westerns suddenly writing science fiction novels, and they had no idea, no background in science whatsoever. So it would be a Western in space. So instead of going to, dead Donkey Gulch, they would go to the Last Chance Saloon on Venus, where the air is completely breathable and everyone behaves exactly like they might in Las Vegas. So anyway, but the book itself is mainly just about the cover art from that period, and it's just a celebration of the weird and the wonderful and the sometimes absolutely awful cover art from that period.
And some of which you pastiche in XX and in the Black Locomotive, or at least with Black Locomotive, it's more the newsletter. The fake issues of the newsletter that you
yes, and novel number 3, I seem to be doing that all over again. It is partly a fictionalized retelling of the kind of English comic and storybook publishing scene throughout the 20th century, with fictional characters, fictional heroes from fictional comics, a lot of which I've designed and mocked up and done in the style of a period publication. So yes, there's more of that to come.
Yeah, how much, and it's something that really comes up in the introduction to Ray Guns and Rocket Ships, that sense of, again, beyond the collector's passion, the veritable detective work you have to engage in sometimes, or that you found yourself engaging in, trying to figure out if a piece of art was actually, intended for X versus Y, and, what was the publication history behind these things. I guess the question is, where do you find that starting for you, that sense of wanting to sort of plumb in those depths with not necessarily this phenomenon of science fiction covers, but that sense of, I just need to know more. I need to try to get under this and figure out what this really is.
Well, it's one of the nice things about writing novels, I found, is that it's very easy to get distracted by all of these interesting stories that may end up not being in your novel whatsoever. But I think you've got to, it's not just the writing time, it's the, this might be interesting. And then you disappear off for a few days or a week to investigate something. And then you realize, no, maybe that's another story for another time. But it's still interesting and it's still valuable, I think, because the journey is what makes these projects interesting. But the genesis of the new novel, one of the stories that stuck with me is that there's in the early days of the private, sort of English private press scene, well, early days, the sort of post William Morris Golden Press scene, there were generally set up by fairly well-off people who just fancied having a small private press where they would print poetry and maybe a bit of Shakespeare or some of the classics, and then slip in some of their own material as well. Yeah. So it was like Vanity Press by another name. And one of these was a press called the Doves Press, which was on the river near Hammersmith Bridge in London. And there's a pub called the Dove, which is still there, which is a beautiful old, I don't know how old it is, but it's one of those pubs where you're never really sure where the ground level is. It goes up and down, and there's a balcony that overlooks the Thames. And it's this sort of ramshackle place that has probably evolved over many, many... It has no architectural form. It's just evolved. So the Doves Press was just a few doors down from that, and there was now a museum there. But the story of the Doves Press is that it was run by these two guys, and one of them was very much a purist, and he had a typeface, a font designed in one size, set in one size only, that for the use of the press and the press only. And this was based on Venetian types. I think he went to see a lecture, and whoever was giving the lecture was talking about early Venetian types, and he thought, this is what I need for this project. So he commissioned this Venetian type. And these two owners of the press fell out. And because the first guy didn't want to see this type used on anything else, over the period of a year or so, he took the type, pocketful by pocketful, over Hammersmith Bridge and threw it into the Thames. So when this guy came to took ownership of the press, there was no type because it had all been thrown over the bridge into the water. But I
seem to remember Haley Campbell writing something about this. I think Haley Campbell did an article kind of researching some of this stuff, or trying to figure out where it all went.
I'd be interested to... Okay, I didn't know she had done that. Oh,
yeah.
check her out.
It's I'll have to look it up. I'll zap you afterwards. But.
Yeah, no, but I mean, they have the museum there now, which you can. Obviously, the place has been redecorated and refitted so many times. There's not actually anything of the original press there, but it's interesting to go and stand in the actual house where this happened. But because the books survived, there is a digital version of this font and has been for a while. But then some years ago, divers went down and found a quantity of the original type on the floor on the bed of the Thames, and this was then sort of put on show, and then sort of new digitization, which you can buy online. I can't remember the chap who did the research on this and did the digitization, but he's done a very faithful and loving digitization of this. And this obviously fed through into the beginnings of novel number 3, and so I imagined that the roots of, say, a modern multinational publisher might go back to one of these peculiar small press outfits, which will run, like I say, almost like a sort of vanity press rather than a money-making concern. But I liked the idea of sort of tracing a kind of line through from something like that, maybe through the history of English story papers and comics up to the present day, and using that as a sort of background in front of which I tell a more metafictional story about the nature of storytelling. So it's stories upon stories and characters talking about characters, and maybe characters being the characters that they are talking about, etc., etc.
I'm hearing another XX coming out of this, or at least in terms of scale. But
well, I'm looking at it now on InDesign, and the page count. It's. I'm up to about 670 pages.
Yeah. See, now I know you're still writing, so
I'm still writing. Yeah. But this one has got sort of comic strip interludes as well. So as well as just text and illustration, it'll go into short comic strip interludes as well.
Yeah. Well, would you mention the short story idea? I'd wondered whether you had considered, including comics alongside the prose and typography, whether that's whether it's feasible for you, in terms of what you're trying to do with some of these.
In the third novel. I am drawing some of these comics myself. I've recruited a few comic book people whose style is... They can do certain things far better than I can do them. So, for example, there'll be I won't talk too much about this because it's still a work in progress, but for example, I need a romance comic interlude, and I thought I know someone who'd be perfect for that. I needed a kind of Modesty Blaze style sort of English spy adventurer interlude, and I thought I know someone who'll be perfect for that. There are other interludes which I have drawn myself in various different styles, but I think it is, like with both XX and Black Locomotive, there were these collaborative elements, maybe not in the body of the text itself, but these peripherals like the album and what have you that enable. It's fun to see people take elements of your project and elucidate on them somehow. So I really enjoyed that process. So this was another opportunity to pull in a few people and let them loose on a very small part of something, but something where they could shine and where their specific talents would really be useful.
Which is better than my only fear was, given some of the fun you've had on Instagram in the last year or two, the use of AI and
yes.
That Midjourney type stuff has, I recorded with Dave McKean right after that was first blowing up, and he did that prompt book where he was trying to come to terms with what, that sort of stuff meant. You've had a lot of play. You've put a lot of good stuff or a lot of interesting stuff up online from, different prompts you've been using. Can you talk a little about what you're seeing from AI generation of work?
Yeah.
And do you worry about putting yourself out of a job with some?
Well, it's. I mean, I think Dave has got a good take on this, and we've spoken about it quite extensively. But I think it cuts both ways, and I know people who think this is the end of artistry, this is the end of illustration, this is the end of so many things. And I know other people who think the door has just opened on something new and magnificent and interesting and world-changing. I think it is one of those moments where so many industries will pivot. I can see that happening, and I'm sort of excited for the possibilities of that, but I'm also aware that a lot of industries will change beyond recognition. A lot of people will probably lose their jobs. I mean, to begin with the positives, I think that AI, outside of the creative industries, I think AI is already making vast inroads in things like drug manufacture and discovery, protein folding, sifting through the vast quantities of data that, say, CERN produces to look for patterns in, say, fundamental particle collisions, or looking at data from JWST and sort of sifting theories about, say, dark matter and the evolution of the early universe, all this kind of stuff. I think because it involves seeing patterns in vast quantities of data that we might miss, I think is really exciting. I think that's where we're really going to learn some interesting things. In the creative industries, I think that I think, well, to preface this, I think that what's telling is that from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the people who have taken the brunt of automation and new technology have been the working class. They have been the ones whose jobs, from the Luddites trying to trash the steam loom onwards, they have been on the sharp end of innovations in technology. Theirs are the jobs that are being automated and quite often just do not exist anymore. And I think there was, the white collar jobs were always seen as being mind work rather than physical labor. And that intellectual aspect of them was considered to be almost immune to automation. And I think there was a certain amount of snobbery there. It was like, okay, it's okay for these working class jobs to disappear because we're above this. Our jobs will never disappear. And I think that the fact that it's now encroaching into writing and imagery and editing and programming and all of these things that are very much white collar jobs for the first time, I think that a whole new demographic are getting what those people who were put out of work in the Industrial Revolution got all those hundreds of years ago. And they're finally understanding what it's like to put your life into something and then for some innovation to come along and completely make that entirely redundant. And those skills that you've spent a lifetime honing and polishing, and no one wants those anymore. There is no need for those anymore. So that said, I think that any new disruptive technology is like this. It has its ups and its downs, and there will be winners and there will be losers. And I remember in the early days of, say, when computers started making inroads into music, for example, the Musicians Union here did this massive campaign called Keep Music Live. They didn't want synthesizers and computers in music. They wanted to picket people who were using this new technology. They just wanted session musicians to have jobs, to be able to play, to not be replaced by synthetic versions of a piano, a guitar, or whatever it was. They fought very hard against that new technology. And a lot of them lost their jobs. But from that new technology came whole new ways of expressing ourselves musically. I mean, without sampling, we wouldn't have got hip hop. Without synths, we wouldn't have got electronica. There would be no craft work. There would be no so much
I've had
dance
Thomas Dolby
music
on the show. I know. Yeah.
Sorry, say that again?
Yeah. I've had Thomas Dolby on the show.
Yes.
We've talked about especially the early days and how difficult it was to program these things, but everything that advanced and what it enabled and allowed, not just the replacement they feared. But,
I think that there was some enormous cultural possibilities that came out of the invention of the computer. So I just think it's another one of those pivotal moments where we will have to figure out how to live with it. It's not going to go away. I think that the data set that these things are trained on obviously contains enormous amounts of copyrightable material. And just like with music sampling, I think the lawyers are gearing up because they can smell blood in the water, and they're going to thrash out through the courts the legalities of all this, just like they did with sampling in music. And we get to a point where hopefully it's more equitable, where people whose drum loops are being lifted get some recompense from them, where whoever the chap is who did the funky drummer, what's his name?
I'm blanking. I know what you mean. And I was just going to cite that De La Soul record that De La Soul could never bake.
Yeah, the De La Soul album has finally been released because I think it took that long for them to clear all of those samples from the Steely Dan.
Oh, Clyde Stubblefield. Clyde Stubblefield. That's the artist. Yeah.
So, as with all technology, it sort of runs ahead of us. And then the social fallout and the legal fallout and the creative fallout, we kind of have to figure out how to deal with this afterwards. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. So my feelings, I find it... So I've been using Midjourney mostly to generate some of this imagery for novel number 3. And what astonishes me is how specific I can be in the imagery that I create. And that specificity is describable probably in 30 words, maybe less. And on the one hand, it's easy to generate imageries. On the other hand, the fact that you can write 20, 30 words and get something that is precisely what you want, I find astonishing. And it just goes to show that the value of those 20 or 30 words might be the same value that, say, a novelist at the top of his game might bring to honing 20 or 30 words of prose in a epic novel. There's nothing easy about doing that. There are crib sheets that will tell you how to get certain effects using certain terms, when people share these online. So it's very much a kind of, people pick tips from other people who are using Midjourney in order to get certain things. But when you look at the vast majority of the results that you see on Midjourney are, as Dave says, they're sort of they're like D&D elven princesses in brass breastplates wielding broadswords that would have eyes as big as manga characters. So it's a kind of it's a somewhat damning critique of the imaginations of the people who are using this tool, that is what the vast majority of them seem to want to generate with it. But it's a tool, and you can create some things that are utterly unlike that, utterly unlike things that you've never even seen before. And some of the more intriguing results that I've got I've been trying to do prompts that are as short as I can make them, say 2 letters, 3 letters, 1 letter. and you get very, very random results, very unpredictable results. But I think it relies more on some kind of popularity, what people generally like.
That it's a gestalt, like it's collecting the mass number of things. It leans towards what the most people seem to be picking is what I
yes, it's exactly that. It's real experience. Yeah, so the less specific you are in your prompts, the more it will fill in the gaps with a kind of generic Midjourney look that will tend towards what most people are using Midjourney for, which is that kind of very slick fantasy art, or shots of Donald Trump being, I don't know, arrested on the toilet or whatever else people come up with. So it's like an insight. It's like an insight into the psyche of the people who are using this tool, and their interests and their predilections and so on. And it's also, because it's using a vast back catalogue of images that it pulls from the internet. It's like all of art history is there for you to plunder. And this is where the moral aspects of it come in, because I think that people are using it to mimic living artists' styles. So they will be able to create insert your favorite contemporary artist here, style piece without it actually being by that person, thus either not having to employ them to do it in the first place, or coming up with something that is not copyrightable by them, even though it's obviously being trained on what they have done. And I think that's the thing where, for me, that's a line that I would not want to cross. But I think that if you want something, I mean, what I've been using it for in the third novel is, say, generating imagery that looks like it might be from, say, the 20s or the 30s, featuring some of the characters that I've created. So I'll put in a visual description of this character, and then say, in the style of a magazine cover or a pen and ink drawing, 1930s, 1950s. And so I'm not using specific prompts. I'm using sort of more general stylistic prompts in order to anchor it in a certain sort of visual sensibility. And that is astonishing how... And then what I'm doing is, you might re-roll that. Sometimes I re-roll it hundreds of times with minor adjustments for color and composition and things like that, until I'm sort of happy with what I've got. And then I'll pull that into Photoshop and I'll draw over it. So I'll sort of add elements to the costume and maybe even different backgrounds, and then I'll add type. So if it is, say, a magazine cover, I'll design a masthead and overlay that over the top and distress it to make it look like it's an actual old magazine. So there's a lot of sort of post-production on it. So it's this kind of hybrid way of working where you generate elements and then montage them together and then add other graphic elements on top of that. So that's where I'm at using it at the moment.
I get the tool aspect, certainly, when you bring up the doing pastiches in particular artist styles, which, again, you said you'd avoid. It puts me in mind, you wrote me a few months ago, and I haven't watched it yet, but the documentary about Roy Lichtenstein and whether it's art or plagiarism or both, because that seems to fit right into what we're talking about here in terms of not, again, how you're applying it, but when it comes to, am I making art here, or am I just kind of making a computer give me a Russ Heath drawing that I've stylized and can call my own? It's
Well, I think the real issue with the Lichtenstein is that the people who celebrate him and pay tens of millions of pounds for his pieces do not know that it's a Russ Heath drawing. I don't think that anyone's selling Midjourney illustrations for tens of millions of pounds and or dollars. And I think if Lichtenstein had done what he had done with the permission of the artists that he was taking his imagery from. And the galleries credited them and saw that there was value in the source material that Lichtenstein had lifted his imagery from. I think it would be less problematic. It's not necessarily what he did that is the problem. It's the way that he did it, I think, that is the problem. And that it's reflective of the way that a lot of these very, very hardworking and in their latter years, not very well off artists saw none of the benefits of the vast amounts of money that their plagiarized work made for other people. So if you're going to talk about how this might directly reflect in something like Midjourney, I think you need to do a deep dive into the training data set that Midjourney uses. And I'm sure that there are a lot of copyrightable material in that data set. Without even naming artists, sometimes it'll throw up results and I'll think, that looks a bit like this. And so it's morally ambiguous in so many ways. I mean, I certainly don't have set answers and sort of clear answers to how this is going to.
No, but I'm glad we can have this sort of conversation about it, and that clearly it's something you've considered. You're not just throwing stuff at the wall. I mean, you have thought about what this means in a lot of different ways.
Yeah,
so.
And in fact, bizarrely, that sort of is one of the threads of novel number 3 at the moment. So it's sort of like weirdly appropriate that I use a tool that is spoken about. There's a fictionalized version of the tool in the novel.
Sure.
But it seemed entirely appropriate to again sort of match the form with the content in this way and to talk about it. But
did you ever imagine? Sorry, go on.
But I think that sort of only time will tell how the legalities of this and the how this eventually falls out and how we end up in 2 or 3 years is going to be interesting. Yeah, it's a lot of move fast and break things mentality that, I'm not sure. Again, you can't unbreak some of these things. No.
So we'll see. But anyway, the last couple of questions I wanted to ask, when we talk about the Black Locomotive and the Smokebox Club, were you a train spotter growing up?
No.
Did you have a particular affinity for? Okay,
No.
I wasn't sure if it comes from a personal bent.
I wasn't at all, and I had to do a bit of a deep dive because I know that archetypally train spotters are going to be the first people who are going to call you out on things that you got wrong, and there are a couple of things that I did get wrong, and if ever I get an opportunity, I'll sort of go back in and fix them, and they're sort of minor technical things. So no, one of the things I needed to know was on the front of an old steam train, the smoke box, hence the Smokebox Club. The smoke box is the front of the cylindrical part of the engine. And it's got a door that opens, it hinges open. And in there are all the ashes that need to be cleaned out on a regular basis. And the locking mechanism for that round door are those 2 handles that look a bit like hands on a clock. And this is the motif, one of the motifs that I use throughout the Black Locomotive. So when you join the Smokebox Club, you get sent a Smokebox Club badge that is 2 hands on the front of the locomotive, a stylized version of this. And then later on, you discover that and the head of the Smokebox Club is the chief engineer. And later on, it's revealed that Churchill at one point was a chief engineer. And the V for Victory, 2 fingers held up, he actually stole from the Smokebox Club secret hand sign, which was those 2 fingers but pointed down rather than up. So I approached the whole sort of history of steam, if you like, more in a sort of symbolic cultural way rather than I had to get the specifics of it right. And the legend of the Strategic Steam Reserve is actually a real legend. And there are various theories about where the Strategic Steam Reserve might be. And I chose the location I did choose just because it seemed perfect. I think that most people think that the Strategic Steam Reserve was never really a thing. But it's just such a wonderful urban legend that I had to sort of use that as the basis of my story. And the story, obviously, one of the sort of thematic threads in it is new technology, the tunnelling of Crossrail under London and what that discovers. So that's the latest in train technology, if you like. And then the kind of last hurrah of the old train technology obviously being steam. And I wanted to emphasize the new against the old and give the old its last hurrah, its last mission, its last days in the sun. And I thought it had that. I just wanted something that would be resonant of old technology, but also resonant of sort of English history and the history of London as well. And that's why it was perfect for that. So a sort of short anecdote. I needed to find out where those hands on the front of the smoke box could be positioned, because do I have them pointing up? Do I have them pointing down? Maybe the mechanism only allows them to be in certain positions. So I posted a question on one of these train enthusiast message boards, and very helpfully somebody took a picture of the mechanism and showed that one of them always had to be upright, in other words, in the 6 o'clock position, but the other one could be pretty much anywhere. But someone else who had actually worked on the steam trains, so presumably is not a young man anymore, disagreed with some minor point that this guy had made, and they got into a bit of a flame war that I had accidentally kicked off. So after they'd been back and forth several times with this sort of mounting vitriol and name calling, I just had to say, thanks guys, thank you so much.
Gotta get back to the book.
And sort of duck out of the whole thing. So I was kind of half expecting when the novel came out that I might sort of,
be
raise the
by one camp or the other.
Of train spotting purists somewhere who would find fault with everything. But what happened is I got this email from the guy who runs Hornby Trains, which is like a venerable old English toy train manufacturer. I think Hornby itself is probably another one of those legacy names. It's not owned by Hornby. Probably doesn't exist anymore other than a label. It's owned by some other investment conglomerate. But he invited us to go and see the Hornby Museum, which is in Margate, which is a seaside town out on the East Coast. And they have a magnificent museum there full of old packaging and things that I love from a graphic design point of view.
Sure.
And then he said, "Oh, you've got to see this. I've got something I want to show you this." And he took us out back. And out back was a massive shed. And in that shed was a collection of real steam locomotives. And and it's not open to the public yet, but at some point, hopefully it will be. But it was just like, and here,
your steam reserve. Wow.
Draw back the curtain, is the Strategic Steam Reserve. And so I got a little bit of that thrill myself that I was hoping to evoke.
You inculcate it in the book, or you capture it in the book.
Yeah.
You get it very, very well. The sense, I don't want to say a Boys Weekly vibe, but
yes.
But yeah, that majesty of, the steam train coming to life the way it does, it's a thrill. It's a thrill in the book, and it feels like the culmination, as you put it. I mean, you put it in the book at some point. The future, as always, is built on the technology of the past. There's that sense that that this is always here. This mechanism, this way of building the machines, or what it all meant. That it's best to hold on to those things instead of simply ironing over it all.
Yeah.
But last real question: who are you reading?
Who am I reading?
You know, I always ask that of people.
Oh, God. So...
I assume a lot of it is for research for what you're doing. But
yeah, I've just been writing, and the books and comics and magazines that I normally accumulate have just been piling up unread just because I'm just trying to get to the end of this third novel. What am I reading? God, I can't even think. I'm reading J.G. Ballard's last novel, which is called Kingdom Come, which I'm about halfway through. I read Laurent Binet's The Seventh Function of Language, which I thought was very good. And I've just bought his first novel, which is called HHHH.
Yeah, I've got that.
What did you think of it?
On my bookshelf. I haven't read it yet. I picked it up because it just sounded so perfect as a novel, but I'm embarrassed to say I haven't actually started it. So
yeah.
So we'll have to read it together. We'll make it our little book club.
What else have I got? I'd have to go downstairs and have a look at what's on the table.
No worries. Those are both good ones to cite for people.
Nice. Lots of ridiculous design. I just bought Neville Brody's new monograph, so I've been leafing through that. And I was at A-Type I in Paris, which is the sort of big typography conference every year, and sort of came back with all manner of sort of vintage type catalogues and whatnot. So a lot of that will probably feed through into new type designs. I mean, I haven't had much of a chance to do much in the way of new font designs of late because I need to finish this novel.
Third novel.
Yeah, yeah. So there's sort of lots of inspiration waiting in the wings. I mean, the text font for the new novel is a font called Salient, which I mostly design sans serifs or decorative headline fonts, and less so text small size serif fonts. Book fonts, but I thought that I needed to. So this new novel is set. The actual text. I mean, some of the text, not all of it, in both XX and the Black Locomotive was set in fonts that I designed, but the main body of the kind of regular book text was not, because I didn't have a book font that I had designed that would suffice. So I used Minion and I used Perpetua, I think, in the Black Locomotive, whereas the sans are all, I think Korolev and Paralucent were both mine. So I needed a serif book font, which is what I am now using for the third font. So yeah, I'm getting into the subatomic physics of book craft. Here.
And I know we're going to go on forever because I'm going to ask another question about this, but the difference between designing for sans serif versus, a serifed book font? Is it something that's really super specific from a designer point of view that, I don't really feel comfortable working in that. I'd rather stick with, again, like you say, that sort of headline fonts.
I think the main difference is that the sans serif fonts are primarily exercises in geometry, circles, squares, lines. And you have to, it's not pure geometry because you have to optically correct everything so it looks elegant rather than is mathematically correct, does not look visually correct. But the process is very much one of visual refinement. When you're designing a serif font, a serif has a rich cultural heritage. That serifs come from the tools that we used to write. So it might be a quill pen or a chisel on stone or whatever. So embedded in serif fonts are an enormous number of sort of historical spandrels, if you like. They're like weird things that have become acceptable in the design of a serif font that, if you trace back to their origins, are there because of the way that a quill pen might flick up at the end of a stroke or something like that. they're sort of formalized byproducts of the tools that we used, where that just is not the case in a geometric sans serif, because it's constructed rather than drawn. So when you're designing a serif font, the question becomes, how much of that do you honor? And how much of that do you jettison because you shouldn't be a slave to history? And focus more on it being internally consistent within the font that you're designing. And I think what's interesting is that it's perfectly possible to rationalize a serif design to the point where it's still a serif design, but it's a geometrical serif design. And somewhere between being too worried about honoring historical precedent and jettisoning that entirely is a kind of sweet spot that makes sense for me. And I think that that's where Salient sits. So it tries to be more consistent in the way that stroke terminals end, or the italic is related to the upright, things like this that more modern fonts demand. And it looks more contemporary if you do have that internal consistency. But then sometimes I'm sort of drawn to the idiosyncrasies that sort of give it character. So you're always thinking, do I leave this in? Do I take this out? Do I maybe lessen it somewhat? And
how's it going to look when it's alongside other certain letters? And
exactly. And you've got to see these things in context. So you can't just look at a letter on its own and make a decision. You've got to see how it works in text. And I think one of the joys of being a designer as well as a type designer is that you use your own fonts and you learn so much in the using of them as to what is successful and what is not successful. And you can then go back and tweak things and alter things and polish things in the full knowledge that you're road testing this thoroughly, rather than putting something out that might work as an intellectual exercise, but doesn't really work that well as a functional tool for someone else to use on a piece of graphic design, which is fundamentally what a font needs to do.
I suspect we could go another hour talking font stuff, but I want to give you back your Saturday. But this has been wonderful.
Happy to chat further if you want to. So yeah.
I know. Trust me, this is something I realized. I should have been asking about font design from our first conversation onwards, but we'll save that for the third go round. But thanks so much for the time on this, and I'm so glad to see the Black Locomotive come out in the U.S. And I'm also going to be sharing ray guns and rocket ships. I'm going to be at a festival in a couple of weeks with John Clute, the sort of science fiction historian, and Michael Durda, this great book reviewer here in the U.S. It's a literary science fiction and fantasy festival. And if they don't know about this book, I suspect they're going to plotz over the ray guns and rocket ships too, just because of everything you capture in that one too. So I'm just awfully glad you're continuing to kick my ass and just be more creative every goddamn year. So I'm looking forward to the next one, like I say, and I hope we get to sit down in person.
Absolutely.
If I make it to London, or if you get out to New York. So, but thank you.
No, thank you for your interest and thank you for your support. So it's much appreciated.
And that was Rian Hughes. His new book, The Black Locomotive, is out now in the U.S. from Pan Macmillan and has been out for a while in the U.K. from Picador. I think it's all the same parent company. But anyway, The Black Locomotive is a hoot. It's a fun science fiction story, thoughtful. It's got the semiotics, although not as much as XX, and it has some really great observations on the history of London and the nature of technology. And it's got Ryan's patented typographical experimentation weave throughout. So it makes a great companion to XX. I hope you check both of them out. Oh, and you should also try to get hold of Ray Guns and Rocket Ships from Correro Press. That's Korero. Like I said, that's a gorgeous volume of reproductions of the cover art of Ryan's collection of SF paperbacks in the 40s and 50s. I'm going to bring my slipcase copy along to ReaderCon this weekend so I can show some pals, John Clute and Michael Durda, both of whom I think would have significant interest in this. Now, you should follow Rian on Twitter and especially Instagram, where he does a lot of his AI experimentation, at Rian Hughes, all one word, and at his site, ryanhughes.com. and that's RianHughes. And I'll have links to all of that in the show and episode notes for this one, along with the Bandcamp links for the songs and remixes that Ryan mentioned for the Black Locomotive. And he did hook me up with Scott Hoffman afterwards, and we may be recording a conversation this summer. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast, comes out every week, sometimes twice a week, like this time, with interesting conversations with really fascinating artists and writers and designers and translators and all sorts of culture-making figures. You can also improve the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it. Tell me who I should record with, what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And, maybe we'll make a better show down the line. You can do that by sending me an email, DM, postcard, letter, or leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. And let's see, that goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, you get cut off. Just call back and leave another message. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with listeners, but I would never do that without the speaker's permission. So let me know. Oh, and if you have money to spare, as much as I'd appreciate it, because we're all driven by money, don't give it to me. I mean, you can subscribe to my Substack. It's free. There's a $50 a year tier if you want to help support the whole Virtual Memories project. But this is why I have my day job, and my expenses for the show really are pretty minimal. So if you do have money to spare, I hope you'll help people in need. There are all sorts of platforms you can use: GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, where you can go and help people who need help with, well, we'll see, with healthcare, with getting artistic projects off the ground, with vet bills, with rent. I just gave this week to the, trying to move the retired publisher Malcolm Margolin into a assisted living place. Malcolm and I had a just barn burner of a conversation in 2016, and this came up on my social media that they need to raise funds to get him into this place to live out his last days. So I donated right away from there. There's things you can do along those lines too, and I hope you will. Now, when it comes to institutions instead of individuals, I give to my local food bank every month, occasionally give to the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, Election Funds, Planned Parenthood. I make targeted election contributions, but I'm a lobbyist, so that's part of my job. But what I'm saying is there are things you can do with your money and your time and resources that'll help us build a better world, so you should do that. Oh, and the thing I forgot to mention in the last couple episodes, I do have the second issue of my zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, available. There's about 100 copies left of issue 2, about 50 copies left of issue number 1, second printing. If you want them, they're free. Hit me up and I'll mail you a copy of each one. They are each 32 pages with essays, poems, photography. The new one has my art. The first one came out before I started drawing. New one has an excerpt of my great conversation with Clive James from 2015. The first one is an excerpt of the Sandy McClatchy conversation, which is also a fantastic one. If you'd like either issue or both, just drop me a line. Like I say, they're free. If you want to send me some money to support what I do between the podcast, the zine, the email, and everything else, you can do paypal.me/VMSpod, or again, subscribe to my Substack, which is vmspod.substack.com. It is free. There's a $50 tier. That's a thing you could do if you wanted to show some support for this whole thing. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.